The story of land in South Africa, especially when we talk about farming, doesn't just begin with a tweet or a news headline from 2025. It's a long, complicated history that stretches back centuries, long before anyone was debating it on the internet. When European settlers first arrived in southern Africa, starting in the 17th century, they encountered indigenous populations like the Khoi and San, and later various Bantu-speaking groups who had their own systems of land use and community ownership. These weren't empty lands waiting for a for sale sign. They were home to people, cultures, and established ways of life that had existed for generations, deeply intertwined with the environment. The initial interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples were sometimes about trade, but pretty quickly they became about something more permanent: land. As more settlers arrived from places like the Netherlands and later Britain, their need, or rather their desire for land, grew significantly. This wasn't a simple case of buying property with a mortgage and a handshake. It often involved conflict, forced removals, and treaties that, let's be honest, were usually heavily weighted in favor of the newcomers who had more advanced weaponry and a different concept of land ownership. One based on individual title deeds rather than communal access and stewardship, a fundamental clash of worldviews. Think about it like this. Imagine someone shows up to your family home, a place where your ancestors have lived for ages, and they have a piece of paper they say now makes it theirs. They might offer a few trinkets, or they might just point a very convincing-looking cannon. This is a simplified way to put it, but the essence of colonial conquest involved the systematic displacement of indigenous communities from their ancestral territories. Fertile valleys, grazing pastures, and vital water sources were gradually taken over, pushing original inhabitants into less productive areas, setting the stage for centuries of disparity and resentment that simmer beneath the surface even today. These early colonial conquests were not just random land grabs. They were part of a broader global pattern of European expansion. For the settlers, land meant wealth, status, and the ability to build a new European-style society far from home. For the indigenous people, it meant the loss of their livelihood, their sacred sites, and their very identity. The introduction of European farming methods also began to change the landscape itself, sometimes leading to new forms of agriculture, but also disrupting traditional ecological balances. This historical foundation of unequal acquisition is absolutely crucial to understanding why land is such a deeply emotional and politically charged issue in South Africa in 2025. If colonialism laid the groundwork for land inequality, then apartheid, which officially began in 1948, came along with a bulldozer and concrete to make that inequality a permanent, legally enforced structure. The National Party, when it came to power, didn't just passively accept the existing land divisions. It actively worked to strengthen and expand them through a barrage of oppressive laws. The most notorious of these was the Natives' Land Act of 1913, even before official apartheid, which restricted black South Africans, the vast majority of the population, to owning land in designated reserves. These reserves made up a shockingly small fraction, initially around 7% and later expanded to about 13% of the country's total land area, and it was often the least fertile land. Under apartheid, this dispossession was taken to an extreme. Laws like the Group Areas Act of 1950 dictated where different racial groups could live and own property, leading to mass forced removals of black, colored, and Indian people from areas declared white. Imagine entire vibrant communities, places like Sophia Town in Johannesburg or District 6 in Cape Town, being bulldozed to make way for white settlement. These weren't just evictions. They were acts of cultural erasure designed to break community bonds and enforce racial segregation at every level of society. The land allocated to white South Africans, meanwhile, encompassed the most productive agricultural regions, the mineral-rich areas, and the prime urban centers, creating a deeply skewed economic landscape. The system was brutally efficient in its injustice. Black South Africans were not only stripped of their land, but also of their right to meaningfully participate in the economy built upon that land, except as a source of cheap labor. They couldn't get loans to buy property in white areas, they couldn't start businesses there, and their movement was heavily restricted by past laws. So when we see the statistics today showing that a significant portion of commercial farmland is still owned by a small white minority, it's not because of some magical farming skill exclusive to one group. It's a direct, undeniable legacy of these discriminatory laws that systematically enriched one race while impoverishing others for decades. This legal framework of apartheid didn't just affect where people lived, it determined their access to resources, education, healthcare, and opportunities for generations. The wealth generated from the land, controlled predominantly by the white minority, fueled the apartheid state and its industries, while black communities in the overcrowded and underdeveloped homelands or Bantustans faced poverty and a lack of basic services. The psychological scars of being deemed inferior and being forcibly removed from one's home, from land that held ancestral meaning, are profound and have been passed down, contributing to the deep-seated frustrations that drive the current land debate. It's a heavy inheritance for a democratic South Africa to grapple with. When apartheid finally crumbled in 1994 and South Africa held its first democratic elections, there was an immense sense of hope and a massive to-do list for the new government. Right near the top of that list, alongside building a non-racial society and ensuring basic human rights, was the incredibly thorny issue of land reform. Everyone knew it had to be addressed. The African National Congress, the party that came to power, promised to return land to those who had been unjustly dispossessed, to redistribute land more equitably, and to provide secure tenure for those whose land rights were precarious. It was a monumental task, aiming to heal one of the deepest wounds of the past. The government launched a three-pronged approach to land reform, restitution, redistribution, and tenure reform. Restitution was about returning specific parcels of land to individuals or communities who could prove they were forcibly removed due to racially discriminatory laws after 1913. Redistribution aimed to provide black South Africans with access to land for residential and productive purposes, often through a willing buyer, willing seller model where the government would help purchase farms on the market. Tenure reform sought to secure the land rights of people living on communal land or in informal settlements, many of whom were farm workers living on land owned by others, giving them more stability. The initial goals were ambitious. There was talk of redistributing 30% of white-owned agricultural land within the first 5 years, a target that soon proved incredibly difficult to meet. The willing buyer, willing seller principle, while intended to be fair and avoid uncompensated confiscation, often led to inflated land prices, lengthy negotiations, and a slow pace of transfer. Furthermore, simply acquiring land wasn't enough. New farmers needed substantial support, training, access to credit, equipment, and markets to succeed. And this support was often inadequate or poorly coordinated, leading to some redistributed farms failing or becoming underproductive. Despite these challenges, there were some early successes and moments of profound symbolic importance. Families and communities, after decades of displacement, saw their ancestral land returned, a deeply emotional and validating experience. New black farmers were established, full of hope and determination to make a success of their ventures. However, the sheer scale of historical dispossession, coupled with legal complexities, bureaucratic hurdles, and limited state capacity, meant that the overall pace of land reform was far slower than many had hoped for or demanded. This slow progress began to breed frustration and disillusionment among landless communities who felt that the promises of 1994 were not being fully realized. The path to equitable land ownership in post-apartheid South Africa has been less of a highway and more of an obstacle course, with numerous stumbling blocks slowing progress down to a crawl at times. One of the biggest initial hurdles was the very mechanism chosen for much of the redistribution, the willing buyer, willing seller principle. While sounding reasonable, it often meant the government had to pay market rates, which could be very high, especially for productive commercial farms. This made the process expensive and limited the amount of land that could be acquired within the available budget, stretching out timelines considerably. Another significant challenge has been the lack of comprehensive post-settlement support for new land recipients. It's one thing to be given a piece of land, it's quite another to make it productive and profitable. especially if you're starting with limited capital, experience in commercial farming, or access to established markets. Many beneficiaries of land reform found themselves without the necessary training, infrastructure, credit facilities, or mentorship. This lack of follow-through support, unfortunately, led to some redistributed farms becoming less productive than before, which then fueled arguments against the land reform process itself, creating a difficult cycle of criticism and unmet expectations. Bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption have also played a very unwelcome role in hindering land reform. The processes for lodging land claims, verifying them, valuing land and finalizing transfers can be incredibly complex and time-consuming, sometimes taking years, if not decades. Reports have surfaced over the years of funds earmarked for land reform being mismanaged or siphoned off, further eroding public trust and slowing down the delivery of land to deserving communities. These internal systemic weaknesses within the state machinery have undeniably hampered the ability to implement policies effectively and reach the ambitious targets set in the early years of democracy. Furthermore, there's the inherent complexity of dealing with competing claims and historical injustices. Sometimes different communities have overlapping historical claims to the same piece of land, requiring delicate and lengthy mediation. In other cases, current landowners who may have bought their farms legally in good faith generations after the initial dispossessions resist selling or feel unfairly targeted. The legal framework designed to protect property rights, while essential in a constitutional democracy, can also make swift, large-scale redistribution challenging without significant political will and often substantial financial compensation, creating a constant tension between justice for the past and stability for the present. Section 5. Sparks in the Tinderbox. Understanding farm attacks and rural crime. The issue of farm attacks and rural crime in South Africa is incredibly sensitive and often becomes a flashpoint in discussions about land and race. It's crucial to state up front that any violent crime, especially murder, is a tragedy, and the attacks on farmers and farm workers, regardless of their race, are horrific and unacceptable. These incidents cause immense fear and trauma in rural communities. We've seen heartbreaking cases like the murder of Glenn and Vida Rafferty in 2020, which understandably sparked outrage and heightened anxieties. 2 men were convicted for these murders in 2022, bringing some measure of justice, but the scars remain. However, the narrative surrounding these crimes can become highly politicized and at times distorted. While some groups, particularly internationally, portray these attacks as a coordinated, racially motivated campaign to drive white farmers off their land, sometimes even using terms like genocide, the reality on the ground, according to most comprehensive studies and police statistics, is more complex. South Africa, as a whole, unfortunately, suffers from very high levels of violent crime, with one of the highest murder rates globally. The majority of these victims, it is important to note, are black South Africans living in townships and urban areas often overlooked in the international discourse. Many experts and farming organizations in South Africa argue that farm attacks, while undeniably brutal, are largely a component of this broader crisis of violent crime, driven by socio-economic factors like poverty, unemployment, and inequality, rather than a centrally orchestrated ethnic cleansing. Farms, often isolated and perceived to hold valuable goods like firearms, cash, or equipment, can become targets for criminals. This doesn't lessen the horror for the victims, but it provides a different context than a purely race-based extermination campaign. The unique vulnerability of remote farming communities does, however, necessitate specific security considerations and responses from law enforcement. It's also true that racial tensions do exist in some rural areas, stemming from historical grievances, ongoing labor disputes, or instances of alleged mistreatment of farm workers by some farm owners. These tensions can sometimes exacerbate criminal situations or be exploited by those seeking to sow division. However, many local community members, both black and white, often emphasize that day-to-day relations are generally peaceful and they work together. People like Bethuel Mabaso, a black community member quoted in reports, have expressed shock at how events are sometimes misrepresented internationally, refuting claims of widespread targeted campaigns against white farmers in their specific locales, highlighting instead a shared desire for peace and safety for all. Section 6. The Global Megaphone, Misinformation and International Narratives. The story of South Africa's white farmers has, quite bizarrely at times, found itself on the international stage, often amplified by a megaphone of misinformation. In May 2025, a particularly striking example occurred when then US President Donald Trump, during a meeting with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, presented images he claimed depicted mass killings or burial sites of white South African farmers. This was a big moment, played out in the Oval Office, no less. One video shown by Trump featured thousands of white crosses, dramatically presented as a burial site. However, this was quickly debunked. The crosses were part of a temporary roadside memorial from 2020, not an actual graveyard of murdered farmers. The misinformation didn't stop there. On May 22, 2025, President Trump also showed a screenshot from a Reuters video, claiming it was further evidence of mass killings of white South Africans. The catch? The video was actually filmed in Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo on February 3, 2025, and showed humanitarian workers with body bags after battles with M23 rebels. The image had been referenced in a blog post that discussed conflict in both South Africa and Congo, but the visual itself was clearly and verifiably from the DRC. The Reuters video journalist who shot the original footage in Goma even expressed his shock at how his work was being misused. These instances highlight how easily images and narratives can be taken out of context and weaponized, especially by groups with a particular agenda, including far-right organizations that have actively promoted the idea that white farmers are under siege. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt even tried to defend one of Trump's videos by citing the Associated Press as describing the crosses as representing white farmers killed in farm murders. But this still didn't validate the mass burial site claim. President Ramaphosa, in that Oval Office meeting, understandably expressed his skepticism and stated he was unaware of the alleged burial sites depicted by Trump, trying to inject some reality into the situation. This international amplification of a specific, often distorted narrative can have real consequences. It can inflame racial tensions within South Africa, make diplomatic relations more difficult, and divert attention from the very real but more complex issues of overall crime, poverty, and the slow pace of equitable land reform that affect all South Africans. It also plays into a simplistic US versus them story that doesn't do justice to the nuanced realities on the ground, where many South Africans, black and white, are trying to build a shared future despite the heavy legacies of the past. Understanding how these narratives are constructed and spread is crucial. Section 7. Voices from the field's perspectives of white farmers today. When we discuss the situation of white farmers in South Africa, it's essential to listen to their diverse voices, as they are far from a monolithic group with a single opinion. Many white farming families have been on their land for generations, sometimes since the early colonial settlements or the Great Trek. For them, the farm is not just a business, it's their heritage, their home, and a deep part of their identity. They often express a profound connection to the soil and a commitment to agriculture, viewing themselves as custodians of the land who contribute significantly to South Africa's food security and economy. There is undeniably a great deal of anxiety among many white farmers. Concerns about security due to rural crime and farm attacks are very real and have led to increased investment in private security measures. There's also uncertainty about the future of land reform policies, particularly around discussions of expropriation without compensation, which, although intended to accelerate reform, creates apprehension about property rights and the potential loss of their livelihoods and homes. Some farmers feel unfairly blamed for the injustices of apartheid, arguing they acquired their land legally under the laws of the time or have since invested heavily in developing it. Despite these fears and the often negative international portrayal, a significant number of white farmers express a strong desire to remain in South Africa. People like Roland Collier, a farmer mentioned in news reports, have indicated their deep ties to the country and their hope for a future where black and white South Africans can unite to improve the nation. They see themselves as South Africans who want to be part of the solution, contributing their skills and resources to a more prosperous and equitable agricultural sector. This perspective often gets lost in the more extreme narratives that focus solely on conflict or exodus. Furthermore, many white farmers are actively involved in initiatives aimed at skills transfer, mentorship for emerging black farmers, and community development projects. They understand that the status quo of land ownership is unsustainable and that meaningful transformation is necessary for the long-term stability and prosperity of the country. While they advocate for their interests and security, many also acknowledge the need for redress and are willing to engage in constructive dialogue about how land reform can be implemented in a way that is fair, sustainable, and benefits the agricultural sector as a whole, rather than destroying it. Section 8. The Unsettled Account, Black South Africans and the Enduring Land Question. For the majority of Black South Africans, the land question is not an abstract political debate. It's a deeply personal and historical wound that has yet to fully heal. The legacy of colonialism and apartheid meant systematic dispossession from ancestral lands, confinement to overcrowded and underdeveloped reserves, and the denial of opportunities to build wealth through agriculture or property ownership. This historical injustice has had profound and lasting consequences, contributing directly to the pervasive poverty, inequality, and economic exclusion that continue to plague many black communities today, more than 3 decades after the end of apartheid. The emotional weight of this dispossession cannot be overstated. Land, for many African cultures, is not just an economic asset. It's intrinsically linked to identity, ancestry, spiritual well-being, and community cohesion. The forced removals and the loss of land severed these vital connections, creating a sense of displacement and unresolved grievance that has been passed down through generations. So, when calls for more rapid and radical land reform arise, they are often fueled by this deep-seated pain and a yearning for restorative justice, a tangible acknowledgement of past wrongs and a pathway to a more equitable share in the country's resources. Many black South Africans see the slow pace of land reform since 1994 as a betrayal of the promises of democracy. While acknowledging the complexities, the frustration is palpable. They witness vast tracts of fertile land remaining in the hands of a small minority, while many in their communities struggle with landlessness, insecure tenure in informal settlements, or the inability to access land for farming or housing. This visible inequality serves as a constant reminder of the economic disparities that still largely follow racial lines, fueling social unrest and political pressure for more decisive government action on the land issue. The demand for land is not solely about large-scale commercial farming. For many, it's about having a small plot to grow food for their families, a secure place to call home, or access to communal grazing land. Farm workers, who form the backbone of the agricultural sector, often live in precarious conditions on farms owned by others, with limited rights and opportunities for advancement. Their aspirations for land ownership or improved tenure security are a critical part of the land reform conversation. Addressing these diverse needs and aspirations is essential for achieving genuine reconciliation and economic empowerment for the black majority who were historically marginalized. Section 9. Bridging the Divide, Navigating Towards a More Equitable Future. As we stand in May 2025, the path forward for land ownership and racial unity in South Africa remains incredibly complex. Layered with historical grievances, economic pressures, and deeply held emotions on all sides. There are no easy answers or quick fixes to a problem that was centuries in the making. However, one thing is clear. The status quo of highly unequal land distribution is unsustainable and continues to be a source of significant social and political tension. Finding a way to address this inequality while ensuring food security, economic stability, and social cohesion is one of South Africa's most pressing challenges. President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration has continued to grapple with this issue, including his visit to Washington in May 2025, which aimed in part to mend ties and correct misperceptions surrounding South Africa's land laws and the situation of its white minority, especially in the face of criticism like that from former President Trump. Domestically, the debate around expropriation of land without compensation continues. with the government seeking mechanisms to accelerate land reform in a way that is consistent with the Constitution and promotes economic development rather than undermining it. This requires careful navigation and balancing of competing interests. Many South Africans across racial lines express a desire for a united and prosperous future. Farmers like Roland Collier articulate a hope for black and white citizens to work together to improve the country. Farm workers like Mbongiseni Shiba acknowledge the country's violent past but also point to current efforts to manage disputes and find common ground. These grassroots sentiments of cooperation and shared destiny are vital, offering a counter-narrative to the more divisive rhetoric that often dominates headlines. Building trust and fostering dialogue between different stakeholders, government, existing landowners, landless communities and agricultural experts is paramount. Ultimately, a successful and just resolution to the land question will require more than just the transfer of land. It necessitates comprehensive support for new farmers, investment in rural development, and a genuine commitment to tackling the broader issues of poverty and inequality. It also demands an honest reckoning with the past, coupled with a pragmatic and inclusive approach to building the future. The journey is undoubtedly fraught with difficulties, but the alternative, allowing historical divisions to fester and deepen, is far more perilous for the Rainbow Nation. The challenge is to transform the legacy of division into a foundation for shared prosperity.